proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
My name's Tom Harwood, and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today. I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked. Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
On Mark Dolan tonight, we have a simple plan, which is to inform, stimulate and entertain in equal measure. It's all about getting your opinions on the national television airwaves. I love my viewer emails, mark@gbnews.uk. So do join me every Friday, Saturday and Sunday for big guests, big opinions and a big presenter. 6'5", don't you know? See you then on GB News.
Join me, Arlene Foster, for The Briefing on GB News. Every Friday at 3 p.m, I'll give you all the latest political news and analysis, and we'll have robust live debate. To make sure that you're caught up on all of the biggest issues of the day, we'll bring on experts in their field. I'll ask the questions that you'd like to ask. We're not afraid to tackle discussions from all perspectives, including yours. Don't forget, The Briefing with me, Arlene Foster, every Friday at 3 p.m. on GB News.
We are GB News, right across the nation. You can get us on television, on radio, on digital. We're absolutely everywhere.
Amazing! You see, amazing!
You remind me of me in the European Parliament. But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the People's Channel.
Magnificent. That's really, really thoughtful.
Come and join us on GB News, the People's News Channel.
Good morning, it's 9:30 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood. Today we're exploring interest rates and the political reaction to the Independent Bank of England's decision. Will they move too fast or too slow? Also, we're to grill the Climate Minister over Rishi Sunak's decision to U-turn on his attendance of COP27 in Egypt. All that and so much more to explore in these turbulent political times. Join me after the headlines.
Good morning, it's exactly 9:30. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. The Bank of England's expected to unveil the biggest hike in interest rates since the 1980s later amid rising inflation. Analysts predict an increase of up to 0.75 percentage points, pushing the base rate to 3%, a level not seen since 2008. It'd be the 8th time in a row that the Bank of England has hiked interest rates. Less than a year ago, the rate was at 0.1%. Home Secretary Suella Braverman will visit Dover today under increasing pressure over her handling of the migrant crisis. It comes as the government's facing potential legal action over the conditions at Manston Asylum Centre in Kent. Rishi Sunak has backed Ms Braverman's handling of the issue, saying she's taken significant steps to address the problem of overcrowding at the facility. A new report examining the emergency response to the Manchester Arena bombing will be published later. The second of 3 official reports will consider whether some of the victims might have survived had the emergency services responded more quickly. 22 people were killed and hundreds injured in a suicide attack at an Ariana Grande concert in 2017. The Foreign Secretary is expected to warn allies that Vladimir Putin's plunging the world's poorest further into despair. Speaking at a meeting of G7 foreign ministers in Germany, James Cleverly will stress the need to work together amid economic insecurity driven by the war in Ukraine. And the British Heart Foundation's warning severe ambulance delays, inaccessible care and growing waiting lists are contributing to heart patients dying needlessly. The charity says there have been around 30,000 extra heart disease deaths since the start of the pandemic. NHS figures show ambulances in England took an average of almost 48 minutes to respond to emergency calls in September. That's well above the target of 18 minutes. TV online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to the briefing with Tom Harwood.
Good morning, it's 9:33 and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now first today, after deciding he wouldn't attend COP27 in Egypt, the enormous climate conference, the Prime Minister has had a change of heart. He announced yesterday he will indeed attend the summit in Egypt next week, after initially declining the invitation, saying he wanted to focus on UK domestic issues. Well, suddenly his diary is free now. And this comes amid speculation that Sunak is drafting plans with the new Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, to extend the windfall tax on energy companies. But could that possibly go anywhere close to plugging what is touted as a £50 billion black hole in the potential autumn statement? Well, I'm delighted to be joined now by the Minister of State for Climate, Graham Stewart. Thank you for your time this morning. First of all, how come the Prime Minister suddenly has such a clear space in his diary when we were being told he couldn't possibly attend this summit only days ago?
Well, if you remember, Tom, he came in facing a whole series of challenges, and quite rightly, the Prime Minister's first priority was to focus on the domestic situation, supporting my department on energy interventions, and of course we passed the energy bill, Energy Act, in order to intervene and support families through this winter, focusing on preparation for November the 17th. So his focus absolutely to get that right. But he's, as we know, he's a phenomenally hard-working, extremely bright and focused individual, and he promised to work flat out from the moment he came into office. He's worked with the Chancellor and is now able to carve out of his diary a visit to the conference, showing his personal as well as this government's commitment to the delivery of net zero.
In the Labour Party have, of course, been calling this a screeching U-turn, saying that it shows weakness that he's been forced to change his mind on this issue. But I want to take a second to consider the other issues where it looks like this Prime Minister has performed some screeching U-turns. Yesterday we were told that all of his campaign pledges from the summer have been abandoned, or at the very least only the sentiment of them rather than the particulars of them remain. I believe we can see some of those pledges that Rishi Sunak pledged over the summer. For example, cutting the basic rate of income tax from 20p to 16p. That is no longer a commitment. He also pledged, as we can see next, to scrap VAT on energy bills. Now, there's been no commitment from that at all since he became Prime Minister. Another one, of course, was Rishi Sunak promising to scrap all EU laws that hold the country back before the next election. That is now no longer a commitment. But those are just a flavour of some of the commitments that Rishi Sunak made over the summer that we're now not seeing come into practice. Is this a defining trait of the new Prime Minister, that he just U-turns on every issue?
Well, hardly, Tom. When the facts change, your opinions sometimes change. And one of the issues we're doing is coming into office. He's wrestling with so many of these big issues, and already has been able to bring the stability and I think sound governance which the country is looking for. Working with the Chancellor, the fiscal situation is challenging. You've talked about black holes. It is challenging. We're seeing interest rates rising around the world. We've seen, I think, the Fed has just raised their interest rates again, and we're waiting for the Independent Bank of England to pronounce today. So, he's absolutely focused, working with colleagues across government and informed by advice from departments like mine to work out the right way to approach it. So you talked about, VAT on energy bills. We've done a different kind of intervention, saving the average family £700 this winter. People are seeing it in their bills because this government is intervening to help families, help businesses get through this winter. And at the same time, we're also focusing on long-term energy security issues, whether it's licenses in the North Sea, whether it's our commitment to more nuclear. So when you're in government, you work right across the whole of government. You use the whole brain of government, if you like, Tom. And that's exactly what the Prime Minister's doing, and he's doing it in a sober, coherent and methodical manner. And it's great that he's also able now to come out to Sharm, lead our delegation and carry on encouraging the rest of the world to follow this country in its pathway to net zero. And we've led the world in cutting emissions, and we've led the world in international negotiations. And I think our presidency, around Glasgow, went from 30% of global GDP being covered by net zero pledges in 2019 to more than 90% today. It's a phenomenal diplomatic achievement, and it's great that the Prime Minister is able to be in Sharm and help make sure that the actions that need to follow those high-level pledges are real, because the science is pretty overwhelming and says if we don't do it, we're not currently on track globally, and we need to do more. And that's why he's going to be part of our team over there, along with other ministers, including me, in terms of championing these issues which we care about enormously and which are important to the whole planet.
I suppose it's of great renown that Greta Thunberg has decided not to go to COP this year. Probably that increases the salience of how important this new summit is. I spent 2 happy weeks in Glasgow last year, and I think it is important to note just how far this country has come, halving emissions since 1990, more than any G7 or G20 country. I think that isn't trumpeted enough, and I'm glad that you have said that on this programme this morning. But just finally, on this issue of a windfall tax, initially your party opposed a windfall tax, saying it would be the wrong signal to send to investment and to those international investors that could help bring down our bills here in the UK. And then a very specific and targeted windfall tax was announced by the then Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, with explicit exemptions for investment to ensure that we can get that investment in our energy infrastructure in this country. Now there are reports this morning that those very exemptions that ensure our reliability and our infrastructure in this country, they could be scrapped. Is that really what this government is considering?
Well, any taxes are a matter for the Chancellor, and we will hear, of course, from Jeremy Hunt on the 17th of November. And I recognise that I am not responsible for tax, and the Treasury is.
Well, Graham Stewart, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Really appreciate your time there, live from College Green outside the Palace of Westminster. Well, as was touched on in that interview, the Bank of England will unveil its latest interest rate rise today, or at least it's expected to rise rates. It would be particularly peculiar if in this inflationary environment it decided to decrease rates. We're expecting to see those rates rise by about 0.75%, matching a similar rise in the United States yesterday. The move, which would bring interest rates to 3%, is of course responding to these inflation rates that we're seeing right across the Western world, which have reached incredible highs, and a 40-year high in the UK in September. The move will, of course, be worrying to homeowners and those with tracker mortgages, which could face astonishing increases. Well, let's get to the bottom of what this means in everyday terms and how it will affect all of our finances. I'm delighted to be joined by the head of macro research at AXA Investment Managers, David Page. David, thank you for taking the time this morning. I suppose, on the one hand, everyone is discussing rate rises, saying that this is a historic rise, that 0.75% rise hasn't happened since, or basis point rise, I should say, hasn't happened since the early 1990s. And yet, on the other hand, interest rates are still at historic lows. And even a 0.75 rise at midday today would keep us far behind where the United States is. What's your view?
Well, I mean, both views are somewhat right. I mean, we're not at historic lows. The Bank of England's been tightening monetary policy since the back end of last year. So they've been gradually increasing rates. But yeah, other central banks have had to move more quickly. And it's, as you suggest, a response to the fact that we're seeing quite significant shocks coming through in energy. Now, the energy shocks themselves are something that should level out. So the impact that the energy shock has on inflation is reaching a peak over the next month or so, we think. We don't really know what's going to happen now after April as the government considers the energy price cap beyond that point. But we do think that as we move into the second half of next year, we'll start to see inflation come down. So the Bank of England sort of sees that there's a peak coming through in inflation, although there's an uncertainty around that. So that's from the energy side of things. But the labour market in the UK still is relatively tight. And that's really what the Bank of England's tightening monetary policy to achieve here today. It's likely to have to squeeze the economy, slow the economy, loosen the labour market a little bit. And that should guarantee that as we move into sort of 2024, we see inflation coming down back towards the Bank of England's inflation target. But the fact that we're seeing very sharp moves now does reflect the fact that, as you say, we're coming from a period of very low interest rates, and we're going to be moving up relatively quickly.
Of course, in September, we were expecting quite a sharp rise as well. Markets were expecting a 0.75 point rise, and the bank came out in the end with a 0.5 point rise, under expectations, and arguably contributed to some of that market turmoil that we saw in the days that followed, especially after the mini budget that came the next day. Was that a mistake from the Bank of England, the way they behaved in September?
No, I don't think so. I think it was just a reaction to the uncertainty of the government. I mean, very clearly, the market turmoil was nothing really to do with the Bank of England. They did a lot to calm the markets in the event of a very turbulent government backdrop. But I think in September, they were just completely uncertain about what the government was going to propose. So they were a little bit cautious in tightening policy going further forwards. The benefit of this meeting is that the bank also every quarter delivers medium-term economic forecasts. So that's what comes out today. In September, they were probably awaiting those forecasts a little bit, again adding to some of the cautious move now. But we do expect them to move by 75 basis points this time around.
Well, let's hope that they don't pull any rugs from underneath us and that market expectations are met, because it would be fairly messy if they weren't. But for now, David Page of AXA Investment Managers, thank you so much for joining us here on The Briefing this morning. Let's get some political reaction to all of this with Olivia Utley, who's joining me in the studio now. I suppose the government really does not want to see particularly high interest rates in the short term, although clearly low interest rates have created a lot of problems in the medium term.
Absolutely. It's a bit of a mixed bag for the government, because on the one hand, of course, higher interest rates will hopefully bring down inflation, which should lessen the cost of living crisis a bit. But the government is very, very worried about people's mortgage rates soaring. And of course, as you point out, interest rates are still low by historic standards. But the difference between now and sort of 30 years ago is that because low interest rates have been bedded into our economy for so long, stress tests on mortgages, for example, are much less rigorous than they used to be. So whereas 30 years ago, someone could borrow about 3 times their salary, 3.5 times their salary, because interest rates were higher and the banks were worried that once the interest rates was factored in, people wouldn't be able to pay back those repayments. Now people are borrowing sort of 5 times their salary, which means when interest rates go up, they're not able to pay their mortgages
People
anymore.
are much more over-leveraged and have borrowed incredible amounts of money, meaning even a little difference in interest rates now would be the equivalent of a massive difference in interest rates back then.
Exactly. And the problem for Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt is against that backdrop, they're planning to impose new tax rises on the UK, and one that's being talked about quite a lot is freezing the rate at which people start paying the higher rate of income tax, freezing it at, I've forgotten the exact figure, but if they do that, then it works out as a stealth tax rise, because against a backdrop of very, very high inflation, freezing that rate will mean that all sorts of people, teachers, civil servants, nurses, get pulled into the higher rate of income tax, which isn't what the higher rate was there for in the first place. Add that to an average of £84 extra per month for those on variable rate and tracker rate mortgages. People are going to be in a very sticky situation this winter.
Very difficult for the government to navigate, I suppose. But looking to that overall fiscal statement, that autumn statement, as we're supposed to now call it, a proper budget in the way that the mini-budget wasn't. I suppose we were going to expect the Chancellor to walk out of number 11 holding his red briefcase aloft, as we normally do on these situations. But what do we expect can the government do to sweeten what is going to be a pretty bitter pill?
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to see what sort of wiggle room they've got. I think we can assume that that £50 billion figure we're hearing all the time, the idea that the Chancellor and the Prime Minister are going to fill it in with £25 billion of tax rises and £25 billion of public spending cuts, is probably a bit of an exaggeration. I think Jeremy Hunt is in sort of expectation management mode, and perhaps some of the threatened tax rises and public sector cuts won't come through. I think one particular policy that they're talking up at the moment is only raising public sector pay by around 2%, when of course the unions are demanding that it's raised by more like 10%. That could be one that's sort of being threatened, and then when it gets to the actual budget, they decide to sweeten the pill, as you put it, by not going ahead with that.
Do you mean to say that politicians might be doing something slightly different from what they say they will do? I cannot believe it. I cannot believe it. But on that note, and we mentioned this a little bit at the start of the programme, about all these U-turns that these politicians seem to be doing, frankly, on both sides of the House of Commons. U-turn if you want to, went the phrase in the early 1980s, but it seems that both of our major political party leaders are for turning. Let's look at the Labour Party leader's track record. Keir Starmer stood to be leader of the Labour Party on 10 pledges in 2020. Now, these 10 pledges included all sorts of things. For example, increasing income tax for those earning over £80,000, abolishing tuition fees, introducing what's called a Prevention of Military Intervention Act, rail, mail, energy and water nationalisation, defending free movement, full voting rights for EU nationals, and the abolition of the House of Lords. Well, how many of those pledges still stand? How many does the Labour Party still back after Sir Keir Starmer won his leadership promoting all of these policies? Not one. We were told by the Labour Party leader's spokesman not so long ago that his policy prospectus was a blank slate, completely wiping away all of those promises which led him to the position which he now holds. But we've discussed what went on with the Labour Party and the innumerable U-turns that their leader has performed. What's new this week is that the new Conservative Party leader, the new Prime Minister, seems to be wanting to match his opposite number for those number of U-turns. As we touched on earlier with the Climate Minister, the government benches really don't fare much better. Rishi Sunak stood for the leadership in the summer, promising to cut the basic rate of income tax by 20%, down from 20p to 16p in the pound. He promised to scrap VAT on energy bills. He promised to scrap all EU laws before the next election. He promised to get maths and English being taught to the age of 18 across the country. He promised to end the practice of housing illegal migrants in hotels. Well, yesterday he boasted about how many hotel rooms he'd booked. He also promised to cap the number of refugees the United Kingdom accepts every year, and promised to target 80% of claims being resolved within 6 months of being lodged in our asylum system. Well, how many of these pledges from Rishi Sunak are being committed to by his government now? Not one. In fact, yesterday we were told by the Prime Minister's spokesman that the sentiment of these pledges stands rather than the particulars of these pledges. What a remarkable contortion of words, that the pledges in their actuality don't matter. What matters is that the sentiment behind them is somehow upheld, even when it comes to the 2019 manifesto. We asked whether the pledges of the manifesto, the promises of the manifesto will be stuck to. What was the answer? The promise of the manifesto will be stuck to. A crucial semantic difference. Not the promises within it, but the broad and vague promise of it. What a shower from our top politicians. Well, let's dive into what this all means now with Sam Lister, the political editor of the Daily Express. And Sam, it is extraordinary looking at across both sides of the House of Commons that these are politicians who've said one thing to get elected, and as soon as they're in the post that they now hold, seem to abandon it all.
Yeah, I think what we've learned from this summer and the last few months is that Tory leadership contests are a complete waste of time. Liz Truss was quite clear in her leadership pitch that she wanted to cut taxes. She arrived in and tried to cut taxes. She was booted out. Rishi Sunak made all kinds of promises, which you've obviously just run through. He comes in and he does the opposite. He ditches all the pledges. So, you know, you either promise things and then try and enact them and people don't like it, or you promise things and then just ditch them when you get in anyway. So it seems a complete waste of time. I think in future, what's the point? Why bother? And it was a bit of an arms race during that contest, wasn't it? You remember it well, I'm sure, that they, you know, one day Liz Truss would pledge one thing, the next day Rishi Sunak would try and outdo it, and as we've seen, it's just a complete waste of time.
It's interesting, though, looking at the two people who stand at those dispatch boxes at Prime Minister's questions, as Rishi Sunak and indeed Sir Keir Starmer did yesterday. They're beginning to sound fairly similar. We're hearing that both of these politicians are backing windfall taxes. They're both saying that the alleged hole in the budget needs to be filled with tax rises. These people are presenting themselves as grown-ups in the room, as relatively centrist. I mean, you can't, frankly, put a cigarette paper between them.
No, they're both very managerial in style, that neither is inherently political. Neither has kind of come up through the ranks of the party. They're both kind of almost on a fast track. They came in at the top ranks. They didn't do the kind of dirty work out there, you know, doing all the political fighting on the ground, working their way up through the parties. They both had big jobs outside of Parliament. So they've come in at a very high level. They've not had to bother with the dirty work. And they both approach it in a very kind of managerial way, which, you know, some people might like, but others think actually you have to get down and dirty in politics. You know, you're dealing with people like Vladimir Putin on the world stage. You know, you've got to be quite rough and tough to cope with these people, and you've got to kind of play a bit hardball. So they are very similar people, as you say, and they're coming to similar policy positions. I think that's slightly more of a problem for Keir Starmer, because his whole thing was to define himself against Boris Johnson. Now he's got to find a way of defining himself, you know, just on his own. He's got nothing to fight against almost, because Rishi Sunak's so similar. But obviously the polls are certainly in his favour at the moment anyway. So we've got quite a long way to go before there's an election.
We certainly do. And I wonder, to what extent does the British public actually want these blank slates leading our two major parties in this country? Is there potentially a feeling out there in the country that politics has been too interesting for too long, and actually what we need is a couple of boring blokes leading it into a sort of more calm waters? I think Sam Lister has just frozen there. Well, we'll have to answer that question another day. Just in our final 30 seconds, Olivia Utley is still remaining with me in the studio. And what do you make of that discussion there, that actually Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak aren't that dissimilar as politicians?
No, I think there's definitely something in that. And I thought from your interview with Graham Stewart, he said a very interesting line that what Rishi Sunak is doing is being sober, coherent and methodical. And I think that sort of says it all. Every previous Conservative Prime Minister we've had for sort of 20 years has stood on the steps of Downing Street and talked about how they're going to redefine Britain. Rishi Sunak hasn't done that at all. He said he's going to manage Britain, basically, and try and balance the books and do all of this sensible stuff, which is exactly what Keir Starmer's promising too.
Really, really fascinating stuff there. Well, we have run to the end of the programme. Olivia Utley, thank you so much, and to all of my other guests as well. An interesting time in politics it is. Follow me for the next 2 hours on To The Point as we dive into these issues more deeply.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually